The first thing the wind takes is your breath. Out in a Wyoming winter that forgot how to end, the air isn't just cold. It's a living thing, sharp-toothed and hungry. And it chews the whole world into a blur of white. The train station has no name anyone bothers to use, just a signboard that screams on a single rusted nail whenever the wind gets angry. A pot-bellied stove inside smokes more than it warms, and a telegraph clicks and clicks behind dusty glass like a nervous insect trapped in a jar. Trains don't arrive here. They feel more like rumors, a hiss of steam, a groan of metal, and then they're gone, a ghost drifting away before you can even prove it was real. Clara steps down from the last car. She moves with the careful dignity of a woman who refuses to stumble, not where anyone might see. Her boots are cracked right at the seams. The hem of her plain green dress is salted with gray slush. She looks like she's been worn down by the journey. But she's known colder things than winter. She's known a grave dug too early for her mother. A house that slowly filled up with empty bottles where lullabies used to live. She's known the slick, greedy grins of men who looked at a girl and saw only coins and compromises. Those men never got what they came for. Clara always paid her debts the hard way. Scrubbing floors, stitching clothes, milking cows, mending fences. Honest work hurts slow, but it leaves you able to look at your own reflection in the morning. This bench, though, this train station bench, is a different kind of hurt. It's taking her pride first, piece by piece. For 3 days, she has sat right here, shoulders squared, her small suitcase planted at her shins like a faithful dog, waiting. The station master asked her once, then again, if she had a name to match to a wagon. She gave it to him both times. Clara Evans. And both times the question just slid off him like sleet off a hot stovepipe. He'd turn and walk away. His job done. The other people who got off that train were gone in hours. Men headed for the mines, wives already claimed by a waiting handshake and a warm smile. They passed in 2s and 3s, their laughter echoing for a moment before the wind swallowed it whole. No one paused to ask Clara if she was warm enough. No one asked if she'd eaten. No one noticed the tiny shiver at the corner of her mouth, the one that had nothing to do with the cold and everything to do with fear. The West is generous with its horizons. It's stingy with everything else. She isn't here by accident. She's here because of a plan. Plans are the only luxury a woman like her can afford. She'd seen the ad in the back of a church paper. The letters were so plain and simple, they felt like a hand held out in the dark. A widower, it said, promised honest work and a quiet life for a woman willing to share both, and to mother a little girl who needed gentleness more than she needed sugar. It looked like a doorway out of a life that was closing in. It looked like a prayer, answered. So Clara saved. She counted every penny, then saved again. She bought the ticket. She closed the door on a town that had wrung every last apology from her and still wanted more. She packed her life into one small suitcase and stepped onto that train, heading west. She even memorized her reply, just in case the man, Thomas, the ad had said, might test her. Yes, sir, I keep a tidy house. Yes, sir, I can bake without wasting flour. No, sir, I have never been paid for my company and won't be. She practiced the words, folding and refolding them in her mind until they were soft as pocket linen. Day 1, she told herself the train must have been early or he was running late. It happens. Day 2, she reasoned that maybe the road had iced over. A horse can turn skittish on a ridge. It's dangerous. Day 3, her mind stopped offering him excuses, and it started offering her warnings. The body shrinks itself when it's hungry. Pride does something similar. She clamps her arms tight across her chest, not from the cold, but to hold the very shape of herself in place, to keep from shattering. Snowflakes fret at her shoulders. They stay there, unwilling to melt, as if they've finally found their rightful owner, someone as cold and forgotten as they are. At 4:00, the station clock announces itself like a judge handing down a sentence. The iron tongue hits the bell, and the sound rolls out into the drifted street, through the bare-limbed cottonwoods, into the empty tavern where the bartender polishes a glass he doesn't expect to fill. 3 days. In a ledger somewhere, the column labeled Clara's time has just acquired its own stark, cruel arithmetic. She does not cry. Tears would only freeze on the way out, and that would embarrass her more than anything. The freight manager shuffles past, brushing frost from a lantern rim gone gray with old fingerprints. You still waiting for someone? He asks. It's the same question as yesterday, but his voice is a little gentler this time. A little sadder. She answers with a nod you could mistake for a shrug. He hesitates. It's the way men do when they want to be kind but aren't quite sure if they're allowed to be. Then he moves on, his boots ticking like a metronome across the frozen boards, leaving her alone again. The stove pops and sighs. The telegraph mutters a few clipped syllables of some stranger's life, a story happening somewhere else, somewhere warm. The sky lowers itself, pressing down until even hope has to stoop to fit under it. Clara studies her gloves. The fingertips are burst, like overripe fruit. She had meant to mend them on the ride west, but the train rattled so much and her hands wouldn't stop trembling. It's not the cold that makes you shake, not really. It's uncertainty. And she's had a surplus of that since the conductor called out the station name, and no one, absolutely no one, stood up to wave. If she gets up and leaves this bench, there is nowhere warm to go. She has no money for a ticket back, and no home to go back to anyway. But if she stays, she is a spectacle. A lesson for the local boys with sleds, who will learn too quickly how to look right through people as if they were smoke. There's a mean little voice that comes to people who have been disappointed one too many times. It doesn't shout. It speaks in calm, reasonable tones, which makes it even worse. Maybe the letter was a joke, it whispers. A cruel prank played by someone with too much time and not enough heart. Maybe the photograph you sent made him rethink words like kind and quiet. Maybe he saw your face and decided he wasn't that desperate after all. Maybe he never even existed outside the ink. She swallows, hard enough to hurt. The word plain has sharp edges when you say it to yourself, over and over for 3 days. She closes her eyes. Not to sleep, but to practice. To practice being the kind of woman who can keep her chin level even when the weight of the world is trying to force it down. The West asks 2 questions of everyone who comes to it. What are you willing to lose to get here? And what are you willing to carry once you arrive? Clara's answers are the same for both. Everything I can bear, and more, if I must. Snow threads itself into her dark hair, little bits of white lace. The bench bites up through her thin coat, a constant nagging pain. Somewhere inside the station, the agent laughs at a joke he won't remember by supper. The train schedule pinned to the wall flutters, like a bird that forgot how to fly south for the winter. If you were standing close enough to hear Clara breathe, you'd hear the difference between endurance and surrender. One is tall and quiet, the other is small and loud. She is still the first kind. For now. And then, because stories, like storms, love a sudden turning, there's a sound. The sure, small percussion of boots on new snow. It's a quick sound. Light. Certain. Not the heavy stride of a man late for an appointment he didn't want to make. It's the run of a child who believes that just naming a thing can bring it into being. The sound stops directly in front of her bench. Clara opens her eyes. She sees 2 braids, a small wool bonnet, and bright red cheeks above a coat that's a size too large. It's a little girl. Behind the girl, further down the platform, a man pulls up short. His hat is pulled low, and his jaw is set by habit, not meanness. He looks tired, worn down. The child points a mittened finger straight at Clara. Her face is lit with the pure glee of discovery and destiny all braided together. "That's her," she declares, her voice ringing out in the cold air as if she's just found a star that no one else had ever bothered to claim. "That's the one I told you about." Clara's heart does something she hasn't permitted it to do in 3 long days. It lifts, not high, but enough, just enough. She doesn't believe yet. Not in miracles, not in letters from strangers, and certainly not in men, but she believes in children who run toward what they need. She believes in moments that arrive like a door suddenly unlocked from the other side. And somewhere deep beneath the cold, beneath the shame, beneath the bitter arithmetic of waiting, a single thought loosens itself from the ice. Maybe what you're owed isn't an apology. Maybe it's a beginning. The 4th morning broke with no wind, and the silence felt louder than the storm. For 3 days, Clara had been a statue on that bench, too proud to leave and too stubborn to cry, until her body had nearly forgotten what it felt like to be warm. She was drifting, barely aware of time passing, when she heard them. Quick, hurried footsteps crunching across the fresh snow. Light, fast, insistent. And then the small voice, bright as a spark from flint. "There. That's her." Clara lifted her head, slow as a stone thawing in the sun. A little girl, no older than 5, stood before her. Her braids were swinging, her cheeks lit bright red by the cold. Her coat was 2 sizes too big, but her eyes, wide and serious, carried something the weather couldn't dull: purpose. She was tugging a tall man along behind her, dragging him with the fierce, unyielding strength that only a child who truly believes in miracles can muster. "Daddy!" the girl gasped, out of breath, pointing straight at Clara with a mittened hand. "That's her! That's the one from the letter! Can she be my mama now?" The entire platform seemed to freeze. The air grew thick, the silence hanging heavier than the snow-laden pines. Clara blinked, convinced she'd finally slipped into some kind of waking delirium. 3 days without food or warmth had worn her mind thin as old paper. But the child's earnestness was a solid, real thing. She believed it. Every part of her believed it. The man, broad-shouldered and weary, wrapped in a frost-crusted coat, slowly removed his hat. His gray eyes, the color of a winter sky, studied Clara's face. They narrowed, not with recognition, but with a deep, unsettling confusion. His voice, when it finally came, was careful and steady, but edged with the roughness of a life lived outdoors, fighting the elements. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble, "forgive me, but do I know you?" The hope that had flickered in Clara's chest died instantly, leaving behind a cold, sharp ash. Her throat burned. The words had to scrape their way out past the lump of humiliation lodged there. I'm your mail-order bride," she whispered, the sound barely audible. "Clara Evans. I arrived 3 days ago. I got your letter." The man's face stiffened. A flicker of something, pity, frustration, crossed his features. Then, with a dawning, terrible heaviness, he slowly shook his head. "Ma'am, I'm sorry," he said, and the words were like stones dropping into a deep well. "I never wrote any letter." Silence fell again, but this time it was different. This time it was sharp. It cut. The little girl's bright smile faltered. Confusion crumbled her brave face, turning quickly to a look of profound guilt. She looked from her father's stern face to Clara's stunned one, her small shoulders hunching up as if to shield herself from a blow. "But you said she'd come," she whispered, her voice fragile as an icicle. "You said someone would come." The man crouched low, his jaw tight, his eyes never leaving his daughter's face. "Mara," he said softly, his voice full of a pain that had nothing to do with Clara. Mara, did you send a letter?" The child nodded, her face crumpling. She began twisting her mittens between her tiny, anxious hands. "I asked Mrs. Dallow at the post office to write it for me," she confessed in a rush. "I told her what to say. I put in the picture of Mama, too. The one you keep in your drawer." For a long moment the world seemed to stop. The snow, the wind, the clicking telegraph inside, it all went quiet, as if in shame. Clara sat there, stunned, every nerve in her body ringing with a humiliation so deep it felt like a physical wound. It hadn't been a man's promise that brought her all this way. It was a child's desperate, lonely wish, dressed up in lies and mailed across the country. 3 days of freezing, 3 days of starving, 3 days of believing she was unwanted, forgotten, not good enough. It wasn't for love or even for a chance at a new life. It was for a mistake, a fantasy spun by a 5-year-old girl. Her voice cracked as she forced the words free, her eyes locked on the man, on Thomas. "I sat here for 3 days," she said, and the confession was raw, bleeding her of the last of her pride. 3 days waiting to be claimed. 3 nights on this bench, in the snow, believing I'd been forgotten, that I was too plain or too old or just that no one wanted me. The words cost her more than the cold ever had. They stripped her bare in the open air. For the first time her eyes stung with tears, though she fought them back, refusing to let them fall. The little girl's chin quivered. "I didn't mean to trick you," Mara whispered, a real tear tracing a clean path down her dirty cheek. I didn't want to be the only one at the town picnic without a mama again." Clara looked at her then, really looked, and through the haze of her own raw hurt, she saw it. She saw the incredible, foolish, beautiful courage it had taken for a child to try and shape her own lonely world into something better. She knelt stiffly, her frozen joints protesting. She reached out and brushed a stray braid from Mara's cheek. "I'm not angry," she murmured, and was surprised to find it was the truth. "You were brave enough to ask for what you needed. That's more than most grown folk ever manage." When she rose again, she faced Thomas. He stood tall, but his shoulders were slumped, heavy with a guilt that was clearly not new to him. His jaw worked, as if the words he needed cost him dearly. Finally, he let out a long, slow breath that turned to smoke in the frigid air. "My name is Thomas Matthews," he said, his voice flat. "My wife. She passed 2 years ago. Since then, it's just been me and Mara." He paused, his gaze flicking from Clara's frostbitten hands to his daughter's hopeful, tear-streaked face. "I didn't mean for you to endure this. I swear to you, I didn't know. I didn't write that letter. But I can't ignore what's happened because of it either." He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not just a stranger, but the consequence of his own sorrow, of his own failure to mend his daughter's broken heart. After a long, heavy pause, he added, "We can offer you a roof, a fire, a meal. Nothing more for now. No promises, no words I'm not ready to speak. Just a warm place to rest until the next train comes through." Clara's chin lifted. Her dignity was battered and bruised, but it had not vanished. "That," she said, her voice clear and steady, "is more than I've had in a very long time." Thomas bent down, picked up her worn suitcase without asking, and straightened up. He didn't reach for her hand. He didn't crowd her with empty, placating assurances. He simply gave a slight nod toward the snowy trail that led away from the station, away from the world. Mara, however, did reach for her. She slipped her small, mittened fingers into Clara's, and she held on tight, as if she had already won the exact thing she'd wished for. Together, the three of them, a broken man, a forgotten woman, and a girl full of impossible hope, walked off the platform. Behind them, the station sat quiet, its clock ticking indifferently toward the next arrival, the next departure. Ahead, a small cabin waited. It wasn't a home, not yet. But it was no longer empty, and though no one dared to name it, something had already begun to grow in the silence between their footsteps. The cabin stood at the edge of the ridge, half swallowed by snow and leaning pines. It wasn't much, just 2 small rooms and a lean-to shed that looked like a strong wind could carry it off. But it was all Thomas Matthews had, and it was all he could offer. When Clara stepped inside for the first time, her boots dripping melted snow onto the rough-hewn floorboards, her arms folded tight around her chest, she felt the walls press in on her. It felt like they were testing her, trying to decide if she was strong enough to belong there. Thomas pointed wordlessly toward a narrow cot pushed against the wall near the stove. "You can sleep there," he said. His tone was clipped, not unkind, but not welcoming either. It was the voice of a man doing his duty. Then, with a brief, almost imperceptible nod, he disappeared into the smaller room at the back, the one he shared with his daughter. There was no fire already waiting for her, no offer of hot tea, no attempt to soften the raw, jagged edges of her arrival. Just the creak of a door closing behind him, shutting her out. Clara sat down heavily on the cot, which groaned in protest under her weight. The warmth from the stove slowly began to reach her skin, thawing the surface, but the silence in the room reached deeper, a cold, empty thing that reminded her this place was not hers. She was a guest, a mistake, a burden. Mara lingered in the doorway of the main room, her wide, curious eyes unblinking. She watched Clara as though she was afraid that if she looked away, even for a second, this strange new woman might vanish like the ghost of a dream. "Do you know how to make apple pie?" the girl finally asked, her voice hushed with a mixture of hope and caution. Clara managed a faint smile, shaking her head. The movement made her feel dizzy with exhaustion. "Not without apples, I'm afraid," she replied softly. Mara's face fell for a moment, but then she brightened slightly. "Mama used to put cinnamon on the crust," she whispered, as if sharing a sacred secret. "I remember that." The simple memory, spoken so plainly, sent an ache through Clara's chest that surprised her. She crouched down, her own body protesting the movement, and gently brushed a braid from Mara's cheek. "Do you miss her?" she asked, her voice softer than she intended. Mara nodded, her eyes suddenly shiny. "But sometimes," she confessed, her voice dropping even lower. Sometimes I forget what her voice sounds like, and that makes me feel bad. Clara tucked the girl's hair behind her ear, her fingers lingering for a moment on the child's soft skin. That doesn't mean you're forgetting her, she said gently. It just means you're growing. The memories are growing with you. The stove popped and hissed, spitting a small ember onto the hearth, but the room still felt colder than the wind howling outside. Over the next few days, Clara fell into a strange rhythm. She wasn't family, but she wasn't a stranger either. She existed in the gray, silent space in between. She rose before dawn each morning to stoke the embers in the stove back to life. She fetched buckets of water from the half-frozen stream, the handle of the pail biting into her bare hands. She boiled oats into a thin, watery porridge for breakfast. She swept the dusty floors and she patched what she could, split seams on Mara's outgrown dresses, worn thin hems on Thomas's work shirts. No one asked her to do these things. No one thanked her for them. But work was the only language she knew, the only way she trusted to prove that she was worth the space she took up, worth the food she ate. When Mara caught a chill from playing in the snow too long, and a deep, rattling cough settled in her chest, keeping her awake through the night, Clara stayed by her bedside. She placed cool, damp cloths on the child's fevered forehead. She hummed old lullabies she hadn't sung since her own mother died, her voice cracked and rusty from disuse. But Mara's restless breathing slowed, and her tiny hand clutched Clara's sleeve as if to anchor herself to safety in a sea of fever dreams. Clara never complained. She never sighed or showed her exhaustion. Even when the lack of sleep blurred her vision and made the cabin walls seem to sway, she kept moving, because that is what survival required. You just kept moving. Thomas moved through these days with his usual quiet reserve. He split wood from sunup to sundown, the rhythmic thud of his axe a constant lonely heartbeat outside the cabin. He tended to the animals in the barn. He rarely lingered in the main room when Clara was there. Yet, something had shifted in the way he watched her. Sometimes Clara would glance up from her mending and find him standing in the doorway, not speaking, not judging, just observing. He would watch her with Mara, a strange, unreadable expression on his face, as though he was seeing something he hadn't expected to find in his own home. He never stayed long, just long enough to leave the impression that his silence was no longer empty. It was weighted now. It was filled with thought. Then the first small signs of a softening arrived, little cracks in the ice. One morning, after a cold, driving rain, Clara was outside shaking the dust from the quilts when she felt a sudden, sharp drip of water hit her shoulder. She looked up to see the roof of the porch was leaking, the wood swollen and warped from years of neglect. That afternoon, as she stood over the fire stirring a thin vegetable soup, she heard it, the rhythmic, steady pounding of a hammer. Stepping outside, her hands wrapped in her apron, she saw Thomas high up on a ladder, carefully patching the hole in the roof with new shingles. "You don't have to do that now," she called up to him, surprised. "It can wait." He didn't look down. He just kept hammering. "Should have done it before," he answered simply, his voice carried away by the wind. But she heard him. That night, when Clara came to set the table for their meager supper, she found something new waiting for her. Placed in the center of the rough wooden table was a small hand-carved picture frame. Inside it was a faded sketch of a woman. Her features were soft and gentle, and she had Mara's same wide, curious eyes. Clara lifted it carefully, running her fingers along the smooth, worn edge of the wood. "She's beautiful," she murmured, to no one in particular. From the shadows by the hearth, Thomas's voice came, low and rough. "Mara asked why we don't keep her picture out. I didn't know where to put it." Clara took the frame and set it right in the center of the table, next to the single candle they lit each night. It stayed there after that, a silent acknowledgement of a love that was lost but not forgotten. And maybe, just maybe, a silent acknowledgement of the fragile new thread that was now weaving its way through the quiet, broken house. The cabin was still cold, but the silence had finally begun to crack. The cabin had begun to change. The oppressive silence no longer cut quite as sharply, and sometimes the sound of Mara's laughter would fill the corners that had once echoed only with the lonely sound of the wind. Yet, beneath these small flickers of warmth, a deep, unresolved tension still pressed down between Clara and Thomas. It was like a storm gathering just over the ridge, waiting for the right moment to break. It finally broke loose one night, as the fire burned low and the snow howled against the windows like a hungry animal. Thomas had been pacing the short length of the room for nearly an hour. His heavy boots creaked against the floorboards, a restless, jarring rhythm in the quiet space. His jaw was clenched tight, as if he were wrestling with words that were too heavy to carry, let alone speak. Finally, he stopped at the edge of the hearthlight, his tall frame casting a long, wavering shadow across the room. His voice, when it came, was gravel deep, rusty from disuse. "Clara," he said, clearing his throat. She didn't look up from the mending in her lap. The tiny needle glinted in the firelight as it moved in and out of the worn fabric of one of Mara's socks. In, out, in, out. A steady, unhurried motion. He took a hesitant step closer, the shadows behind him stretching and dancing. "I owe you an apology." Her hands slowed, but they did not stop. "I should have spoken sooner," he continued, the words coming out in a clumsy rush. "That day at the station. I just left you there in the cold. I let Mara's, her longing, speak louder than my own good sense. You gave up everything to come all this way, and I met you with nothing but silence and suspicion. You deserve better than that." At last she looked up. Her eyes were steady and cool, reflecting the flickering flames. "You didn't write that letter, Thomas," she said evenly. "It wasn't an accusation. It was a simple statement of fact." "No," he admitted, his broad shoulders tightening as if bracing for a blow. "But Mara is my child. Her loneliness. That's my burden to carry. And I should have seen what she was doing. I should have stopped it. I should have spared you 3 days of waiting, 3 nights of freezing on that godforsaken bench." Clara's needle paused, mid-stitch. The fire popped, a sharp sound that filled the sudden heavy space between them. "And you?" she asked, her voice dangerously soft. "Do you feel any of this was your doing? Or is it all just your daughter's mistake?" Thomas's gaze faltered. He couldn't meet her eyes. He rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture that was awkward and unpolished, the motion of a man who didn't know what to do with his own hands. "I've been alone a long time," he mumbled, staring into the fire. "Since my wife passed. I guess I stopped believing in things like love or marriage, at least the kind that starts with promises written on a piece of paper. I've seen too many of those unions crumble into dust, too many vows prove empty." He finally looked at her, his eyes pleading for understanding. "I didn't want to bind you to a mistake, a promise born from a child's desperate hope." His words came out halting and earnest, but they were clumsy, and they landed all wrong. Clara's hands began to tremble. The thread in her lap tangled into a useless knot. She set the fabric down on the cot beside her and slowly, deliberately lifted her chin. "You think I'm here waiting to be chosen?" she asked, her voice low at first, but gaining a sharp, brittle edge with each word. "You think I need your pity to justify my place in this house?" Her voice was rising now, a quiet storm breaking its banks. "I came here because I wanted to build something better than the life I had, not because I needed rescuing." Thomas's eyes widened, the unexpected force of her anger finally settling on him. "Clara, I didn't mean it that way," he said quickly, lifting his hands in a gesture of peace. "You don't have to mean it," she snapped, rising to her feet, her whole body vibrating with a fury she had held back for weeks. "You only have to say it the wrong way, and everything becomes clear. You see me as a mistake, a stray dog you felt guilty for, a burden to be tolerated out of a sense of duty to your daughter." "Clara, listen to me." "I have listened," she cut in, her voice finally cracking with the strain of her restrained emotions. "From the moment I stepped off that train, I have listened to the silence in this house, to every unspoken judgment, and I will not stay where I am, only endured. I will not stay where my worth is measured against the memory of a ghost I can never, ever replace." The firelight flickered wildly over their faces, throwing long, jagged shadows against the walls. They looked like two fighters in a ring. Thomas reached out a hand toward her, but she had already turned away, her shoulders rigid, her breath coming in ragged, uneven gasps. "I don't want you gone," he said, a raw desperation finally slipping through his rough, guarded tone. Clara stopped, her back still to him. For a single, stretched-out heartbeat, the entire room held its breath. Then she whispered, so quietly he almost didn't hear it over the sound of the wind. "Wanting is not the same as choosing." And she walked away into the darkness of the other room. That night, long after the house had gone still, and the only sound was Mara's soft, even breathing from the child's small bed, Clara quietly gathered her few belongings. She folded her worn dresses and placed them neatly into her suitcase, leaving behind the one nicer dress she had saved, the one she had hoped to wear to church on Sundays. She no longer needed it here. She lingered for a moment at Mara's bedside. The little girl's hand was curled tightly around the edge of her blanket. On the small table beside the bed, Clara placed a small rag doll she had stitched together from scraps of old cloth. Its seams were crooked, but it was sturdy. It had been meant as a birthday gift. Now, it was a farewell. Beside the doll, she laid a single folded note. Her handwriting was delicate but firm. The ink was smudged in one spot, where her hand had trembled. "I am not your mama. I'm just someone who got off at the wrong stop." Clara didn't cry. Not when she closed the cabin door softly behind her. Not when she stepped out into the teeth of a blizzard that clawed at her cheeks and stole the air from her lungs. Her footprints vanished almost as soon as she made them, the swirling white snow swallowing all evidence of her departure. The night was cruel, the wind a razor blade slicing through her thin coat, but she pressed forward, leaning into it, her destination unknown. Anywhere was better than a place where she was only tolerated. Inside the cabin, the fire hissed low, throwing a weak, dying warmth into rooms that were already emptying of hope. Thomas sat rigid at the table, staring at the empty chair where she had sat. Her last words echoed in his head, warped by the memory of the look in her eyes. Wanting is not the same as choosing. He hadn't meant to wound her, but he saw now that his silence, his caution, his fear, they had carved deeper scars than anger ever could. By the time he finally went to check on Mara and discovered the rag doll and the note on her nightstand, it was too late. The storm had her now. He threw open the cabin door. It banged wildly against its frame as snow and wind rushed in, extinguishing the candle on the table and plunging the room into a sudden, chilling darkness. The cabin felt colder than it had on the very first day she arrived, and somewhere out beyond the ridge, Clara stumbled on through the dark, carrying nothing but her pride, her pain, and the stubborn, fierce belief that she would rather freeze to death alone than live her life as someone else's burden. The storm did not forgive. The Wyoming night rose up like a solid wall of ice, swallowing fence posts, swallowing trails, swallowing even the memory of warmth. Clara staggered through the blinding white, her world reduced to the next step, and the next, until her legs finally refused to move another inch. Her thin coat, soaked through, clung to her like wet parchment. Every gust of wind was a physical blow, cutting deeper and deeper, straight to the bone. At last she collapsed. She fell against the heavy wooden door of a half-collapsed storage shed behind what looked like an abandoned barn. Its hinges screamed in protest as she forced her way inside, and then silence fell. A silence that was colder, deeper, and more final than the howl of the wind. She curled into a tight ball in the corner, her arms wrapped fiercely around her ribs, her teeth chattering with a violence she couldn't control. The shed smelled of damp rot and old rust, a forgotten tomb of broken tools and dried-out leather. She pressed her forehead to her knees, her vision dimming at the edges. Her breath came in shallow, frosty puffs. Memories, unbidden, began to rise through the fog of cold. Her mother's hands smelling of lavender, the heavy warmth of a handmade quilt, the sound of lullabies sung in a voice long buried under this same unforgiving earth. "When you love someone," her mother's voice whispered through the haze of memory, "you don't have to say it right. You just have to show up." Clara's eyelids drooped. The snow hissed through the cracks in the shed's walls, singing its own soft, deadly lullaby. She was too tired to fight anymore. She let herself drift. Back at the cabin, Thomas discovered her absence far too late. The sight of the little rag doll and the folded note on Mara's nightstand twisted his chest into a tight, suffocating knot of fear and regret. He threw on his coat and stepped outside. The cold hit him like a physical hammer blow. Her thin scarf was gone from the peg by the door. The driving snow had already masked her tracks, but he could see faint, ghostly impressions at the very edge of the yard, leading away from the cabin, leading straight into the heart of the storm. "Clara!" he shouted, his voice ripped raw by the wind and swallowed instantly by the blizzard. No answer. He didn't wait another second. He ran to the barn, his movements quick and urgent. He saddled the old mule, his fingers clumsy with cold and panic. He lit a lantern, its yellow light a fragile, desperate beacon in the swirling darkness, and hung it from the saddle horn. The storm clawed at his face, filling his mouth with ice and his eyes with tears. But he pressed forward, following the ghost of a trail, and then just following pure instinct when the tracks vanished completely. Each powerful gust threatened to shove him and the mule back toward the relative safety of the cabin. But something stronger, something deeper, pulled him onward. It was the memory of her eyes, wounded and proud, when she accused him of only tolerating her. He would not let that be the last thing that ever passed between them. At last, through the dim, gray twilight of a near dawn, he saw it. The dark shape of the abandoned shed. Snow was piled high against its frame, like a burial mound. Thomas slid from the mule and forced the frozen door open, his heart pounding against his ribs. And there she was, curled in the corner, so small and still, he thought for a terrifying second that he was too late. Her lips were blue. Her lashes were dusted with frost, barely fluttering. "Clara," he breathed, dropping to his knees beside her. She stirred faintly at the sound of his voice, but she did not speak. Her body was stiff, ice already lodged in her dark hair. Her hands were frozen into tight, pale fists. He tore off his own heavy coat, wrapped her inside its sheepskin lining, and pulled her hard against his chest, trying to force his own body heat into her. His rough hands moved desperately over her arms, her back, rubbing warmth back into her lifeless skin. "No," he grunted, his voice cracking, hoarse from the cold and from something much deeper. "No, you hear me? You do not get to leave like this. Not out here. Not alone." Her eyes fluttered open, but they were unfocused, seeing nothing. A single tear slipped down her cheek, instantly freezing into a tiny pearl of ice. Thomas pressed his forehead to hers, his own breath ragged. "You are not a mistake," he whispered, the words a low, steady vow in the frozen air. "Not to me, not to anyone. Do you hear me, Clara? You are not a mistake." He lifted her into his arms. Her weight was frighteningly light, as if the cold had already stolen part of her away. He carried her out of the shed and back into the raging storm. The journey back to the cabin was slow and cruel. The snow rose nearly to the mule's chest with every step, but Thomas kept her pressed tight against him, his own body the only shield between her and the grave deep chill that had claimed her. He whispered her name over and over again, a desperate prayer against the wind. He begged her to hold on. He promised her things he had never dared to say aloud, not even to himself. "Stay with me, Clara. Just breathe. Come home with me. Just come home." When the faint, welcoming light of the cabin finally came into view through the swirling snow, the sky had begun to pale with the first weak wash of dawn. He carried her inside, laid her gently on the cot by the hearth, and built the fire up high until sparks roared up the chimney. He boiled water. He made tea. He wrapped hot stones from the hearth in old cloth and set them carefully around her body. Hours passed, and then Clara stirred. The heavy quilt lay over her, the warmth pressing deep into her bones, chasing away the last of the deadly ice. She blinked her eyes, trying to adjust to the soft glow of morning light filtering through the frost-blurred glass of the window. Her throat was too dry and raw for words, but she saw him. Thomas was sitting in a chair beside her cot, his broad shoulders stooped with exhaustion. He hadn't slept. One of his hands was resting, warm and steady on her arm. The other was holding a steaming bowl of something that smelled like oats and honey. He didn't speak. There were no grand declarations, no demands for thanks. There was only his presence, only his care, and that, more than any vow, told her everything she needed to know. The morning broke like a fragile whisper. the pale winter sun spilling across the wooden floor in thin, hopeful slivers of light. Clara stirred beneath the heavy quilt, every bone in her body aching, but she was no longer frozen. She was warm. On the small nightstand beside her cot sat a bowl of porridge, steam curling faintly upward into the still air, and beside it a folded piece of paper. The sight of it made her breath hitch in her throat. Her hands trembled as she reached for it and slowly unfolded it. The handwriting was rough and uneven, the letters thick and clumsy, as if they belonged to a man more accustomed to carving wood than to carving words. "Clara," it began, "I do not know how to say this without getting it wrong again. So, I will just say it plain. I am sorry. Not only for the cold and for the silence, but for not seeing, for not believing in what you carried with you. You did not arrive here with only a suitcase. You came with a patience I didn't deserve, with a strength I'd forgotten existed, with a quiet care that I thought had vanished from this world. Since you stepped into this house, it has not been the same." Mara laughs more. "The nights are less long, and if I am being honest with myself, so am I." She needs you.